She was 44 years old, and she owned nothing in the world but a trunk of sewing tools and $9.40 folded into a handkerchief. The man who put her out was her own husband's employer, a railroad man named Cornelius Vane, who decided that a grieving widow standing too near his depot was bad for business. What little she had left after the funeral, after the debts, after the company's so-called settlement, would not have bought her a week's lodging in the town she had called home for 12 years. So when she stood at a dusty rail yard auction in the Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1888 and raised her hand to bid $6 on a filthy, boarded-up freight car that nobody else wanted, the men around her laughed out loud. A home on wheels, going nowhere, on a spur no train had touched in years. It seemed the last foolish act of a woman with nothing left to lose. But sealed inside the walls of that forgotten car was something that would not only change the whole of her life within a single day, but would return to a broken town everything it had quietly been made to lose. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Etta Rourke. If you're watching this from a place that has been counted out, forgotten, or laughed at, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Etta had not been born to hardship, though hardship would come to know her well. She was raised in a low white farmhouse outside Millersburg, Ohio, the only daughter of a stonemason named Walter Doyle and a quilter named Mercy Doyle, and it was from her mother that she learned the trade that would, though she did not know it yet, save her life twice over. Mercy Doyle kept a wooden basket by the hearth filled with what other women threw away: the worn heel of a stocking, a torn collar, a square of calico faded past fashion, a button with no match. And on winter evenings, she would spread these cast-offs across her lap and turn them, slowly, patiently, into something whole. Etta remembered watching her mother's hands move across scraps that seemed to her child's eye like nothing more than trash. And she remembered the moment, again and again, when those same scraps became a quilt warm enough to wrap a whole family through Ohio winter. Nothing is finished being useful, Etta, her mother used to say, until somebody decides it is. It was a small thing to teach a daughter, perhaps, but it planted itself deep, and it grew into the very shape of how Etta saw the world. That value was not always visible on the surface of a thing, that the eye which dismissed too quickly was an eye that had simply stopped looking. Her father's trade taught her something else, a companion lesson, patience with what could not be rushed. She would sit for hours in the shade of the half-built church her father was raising stone by stone, and she watched him set each block with a care that seemed, to the impatient boys who ran past hollering, almost foolish. But Walter Doyle used to say that a wall built in haste falls in haste, and a wall built with care outlives the man who built it. Etta grew up, then, torn between two disciplines that were really the same discipline, the discipline of seeing what others missed, and the discipline of doing right by it slowly. At 20, she married Daniel Rourke, a soft-spoken young man with ink-stained fingers who clerked for the railroad survey crews passing through the county, and it was Daniel's restlessness, his hunger to see the West with his own eyes, that carried them out to the Dakota Territory in 1875 to a raw new settlement called Larkspur Hollow that existed, at the time, as little more than a depot platform, a stack of ties, and the ambitions of a railman named Jonas Whitfield. Whitfield was, by every account Etta ever heard, an unusual sort of businessman, a tall, quiet, sun-weathered engineer who believed a railroad ought to belong, in some real and lasting sense, to the very people whose land and labor built it. He could not always pay cash for right-of-way or timber or grading work. So in the early years of the Larkspur and Western Line, he issued something he called founder's shares, small paper certificates, hand-signed, given to farmers who let the tracks cross their land, to laborers who laid rail through a hard winter, to the blacksmiths and carpenters, and even, in a few cases, to young clerks like Daniel Rourke, who Whitfield trusted with the company's early correspondence. It was, people said, a strange and generous vision, a railroad owned in small pieces by the very town it ran through. Etta and Daniel opened a boarding house near the depot, feeding and sheltering the rail crews and the drummers and the occasional lost traveler. And for 9 years, that vision held. Larkspur Hollow grew from a platform into a town with a church, a schoolhouse, a mercantile, and a future that seemed, at last, to be arriving on schedule. Then, in the spring of 1879, Jonas Whitfield rode out on a survey trip into the high country west of town to scout a new grade, and he never came back. His horse was found 3 weeks later, saddle empty, grazing along a creek bed 20 miles from where he had last been seen. No body was ever recovered. The territory mourned him as a man lost to the mountains, a casualty of the very wilderness he had been trying to tame, and his partner and chief financier, Cornelius Vane, a cold, precise man from back east who had put up much of the line's original capital, stepped in to run the company in his absence. Slowly, so slowly that no one in Larkspur Hollow quite noticed it happening, Vane began to consolidate what Whitfield had scattered. He bought back founder's shares from hard-up townsfolk during a bad harvest year, offering pennies where the paper was worth dollars, and by the time Etta and Daniel had been keeping their boarding house a full decade, the Larkspur and Western line had ceased, in any way that mattered, to belong to Larkspur Hollow at all. It belonged to Cornelius Vane. The fall came suddenly, the way falls so often do, though its causes have been building for years beneath the surface, unseen, the way rot builds beneath a floorboard while the room above still looks whole. Vane had been cutting costs on the line for a long while by then, deferring repairs on the boilers, running crews past safe hours, buying cheaper coal that burned dirtier and hotter than the engines were built to hold. Daniel had seen it happening from his desk in the depot office and had said as much, quietly, to anyone who would listen, but a clerk's word carried little weight against the company's ledgers. On a hot afternoon in July of 1888, engine number 4 blew a boiler 2 miles east of the Larkspur depot, killing the fireman, the brakeman, and Daniel Rourke, who had been riding along that day only because the regular dispatch clerk had taken ill and Daniel had gone his place, as he so often did, because he could never say no to a job that needed doing. The company's response was swift and, to Etta, unbearably small. A settlement of $40 was offered for the loss of her husband, in full and final satisfaction. The paper called it, and when she went to the depot to ask whether the company might at least look into what had caused the accident, she was met not by Cornelius Vane himself, who rarely showed his face in Larkspur Hollow at all, but by his regional manager, a narrow man named Prentice, who informed her, almost gently, that the boarding house she and Daniel had run for 13 years sat on land leased from the railroad, not owned by them, and that the company had determined it needed the ground for a new switching yard. She had 30 days to vacate. It did not take Etta long to understand the truth beneath the paperwork, that a widow weeping publicly near a depot where her husband had just died was, to a company already fending off bad newspaper coverage of the accident, a liability far more costly than the ground itself, and the fastest way to end the liability was to make her disappear from view. She packed what she could carry, sold what she could sell, and on a gray morning in August, she walked away from the only home she had known in the West with a trunk of sewing tools, a few keepsakes, and $9.40. For 6 weeks, she lived on the charity of a widowed neighbor, and the mending work her hands could still do, taking in torn shirts and split hems from families who could spare a nickel or a jar of preserves. And it was in the course of that mending work, delivering a repaired coat to a rail yard foreman, that she saw the notice chalked on the depot board announcing an auction of surplus rolling stock. The company clearing out old cars to raise cash after a summer of bad press. Most of the lots were unremarkable. Flat cars stripped for parts, a hopper car with a cracked frame, coils of rusted rail. But at the far end of the yard, sitting alone on a dead siding grown up thick with sunflowers and foxtail grass, was a squat, weathered freight car with boarded windows and a door chained shut. And when Etta asked the auctioneer's clerk about it, he lowered his voice the way men do when they are about to say something they only half believe themselves. That car, he told her, had belonged to old Jonas Whitfield himself, his private office car, built special, where he used to do his figuring and his correspondence while the line was going up. Nobody had opened it in years. The yard crews called it Whitfield's Folly and claimed it was bad luck on account of the man having vanished the same season it was finished, and the railroad had simply let it sit forgotten on that dead spur, unlisted in any inventory, until someone finally remembered it existed and decided it was worth more as scrap lumber than as a curiosity nobody wanted. When the bidding opened that afternoon, there was no real bidding at all. The auctioneer called for offers and was met with silence, a few chuckles, a man in the back who said he wouldn't take it for firewood. Etta stood at the edge of the crowd with her handkerchief of coins and thought of her mother's basket by the hearth, of scraps other women had thrown away. And she thought, too, of the plain fact that she had nowhere else to sleep once the last of Widow Pruitt's charity ran out. A boarded car on a quiet siding, chained but roofed and dry, was worth more to her in that moment than it was worth to any man in that yard. And so, when the auctioneer, more out of habit than expectation, asked once more for any offer at all, Etta raised her hand and said $6. The crowd laughed, not unkindly, but not gently either. A widow buying a haunted freight car nobody could even move on a spur that led nowhere, as though a roof that could not be lived under respectably was better than no roof at all. The auctioneer, glad to be rid of it, brought his gavel down before anyone could think better of the joke. And just like that, Etta Rourke owned the strangest piece of property in the Dakota Territory. She broke the chain herself with a borrowed hammer that same evening, and the door groaned open on hinges gone stiff with disuse, releasing a breath of stale, dry air that smelled of old paper and cedar and something faintly like machine oil. Inside, dust lay thick over a narrow bunk, a small cast-iron stove, a fold-down writing desk bolted to the wall, and shelf that had once held ledgers now empty and warped with age. It was, in its way, exactly the kind of shelter Etta needed, small, sound, weatherproof, and she spent the better part of a week making it livable, sweeping years of grit from the floorboards, patching a gap in the roof with tar paper she traded mending work to obtain, scrubbing the little stovepipe clean so she could risk a fire without smoking herself out. It was while she was on her knees scrubbing the floor near the writing desk, 3 days into her occupancy, that her cloth caught on the edge of a floorboard that did not sit quite flush with its neighbors, and when she pressed her thumb against it, the board gave a half-inch and would not settle back. She worked her fingers beneath it and pried it loose, and there, in a shallow cavity built into the very frame of the car, sat a small iron strongbox no larger than a bread loaf, its lid sealed with a simple hasp lock gone orange with rust. It took her the better part of an hour with a chisel borrowed from a neighboring section hand to force the hasp, and when the lid finally gave way, what she found inside was not gold, though in time it would prove worth a great deal more than gold to the town of Larkspur Hollow. There was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with a careful, slanting hand recording names and dates and small sums. A record, she realized as she turned the pages by lamplight, of every founder share Jonas Whitfield had ever issued, from the earliest days of the line clear through to the spring he disappeared, listing farmers and laborers, and, near the bottom of one page dated 1877, the name Daniel Rourke. Clerk, 5 shares, issued in recognition of faithful service. Beneath the ledger lay a bundle of letters, and a folded document sealed in oilcloth, and a slim engineer's journal filled with survey notes, and, in its final pages, an unsettling handful of entries about missing supply requisitions and a rear axle that had been tampered with, entries that read less like the observations of a careless man and more like the private suspicions of one who feared he was being watched. And beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, was a single sheet of paper, formally worded and notarized by a territorial clerk whose seal Etta did not recognize, dated the very week before Whitfield rode out on his final survey. The document was, in its plain legal language, a holographic codicil, a handwritten addition to Jonas Whitfield's last will, prepared, it seemed, in a moment of some private fear, stating that should he fail to return from his current expedition, his personal effects and, more importantly, his controlling interest in the Larkspur and Western Rail Line, represented by the majority founder's certificate held in trust and recorded in the accompanying ledger, should pass not to any named heir. For Jonas Whitfield, a solitary man, had no wife and no children, but to whoever should, in good faith and without knowledge of its contents, recover and restore his personal car to honest use. It was, Etta understood as she read it a second time, and then a third by the dim glow of her lamp, precisely the kind of provision only a man like Whitfield would think to write, a will that trusted not blood, but character, that bet its entire fortune on the same principle Eda's own mother had taught her at a fireside in Ohio, that worth reveals itself to the eye willing to look for it in a thing everyone else has already thrown away. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead with the ledger open across her knees and the lamp burning low. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her, that the woman who had been laughed at that afternoon for buying a worthless car for $6 now held, quite possibly, the true and rightful record of ownership over the entire Larkspur and Western Rail line, a line that Cornelius Vane had spent 9 years quietly, patiently, and it now seemed dishonestly gathering into his own hands. She did not act rashly. Her father's lesson held even now, in the strangest hour of her life. A wall raised in haste falls in haste. And so in the days that followed, Eda moved with the same slow, careful patience she had watched him bring to every stone he ever set. She carried the ledger and the letters, though not yet the codicil itself. To the one man in Larkspur Hollow, she trusted to look at them honestly. Old Amos Ferris, a retired surveyor who had worked under Whitfield in the line's earliest years and had known his hand and his habits better than any man left living in the territory. Ferris turned the pages with trembling fingers and confirmed, without a moment's hesitation, that the handwriting was Whitfield's own. He would have known it anywhere, he said, having read 100 of the man's survey notes. And when Eda showed him the final entries in the journal, about the tampered axle and the missing requisitions, Ferris grew very quiet and admitted that he, too, had always privately doubted the mountain had taken Jonas Whitfield. There had been talk back then, quiet talk that never found its way into any official report, that the survey party supplies had been shorted that season by someone back at the rail office, that a man familiar with the country did not simply wander off a known trail and vanish without a trace. Ferris agreed to put his recollections in writing and to stand as a witness to the ledger's authenticity. And with that, Eda had her first ally. Word, of course, does not stay quiet in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and it was not long before Cornelius Vane learned that the widow he had turned out of her boarding house 2 months before had come into possession of documents concerning the founding of his railroad. He came to Larkspur Hollow himself for the first time in years, arriving on his own private car with 2 attorneys in tow, and he called on Eda at Whitfield's old freight car with an offer that he seemed certain she could not refuse, a sum of $300, more money than she had seen in her whole life for the car and its contents, no questions asked. The matter closed quietly and forever. When Eda asked him plainly whether he was afraid of what the ledger might show, Vane's composure did not break, but something behind his eyes went very still, and he told her, in the smooth and patient voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that a woman in her situation would be wise to take what was offered rather than gamble everything on old paper that a territorial court might not even recognize. She told him she would think on it, and she did think on it, for exactly as long as it took him to leave the yard, before deciding that her answer was no. What followed was not violence, for Vane was too careful a man for that, but it was pressure of a slower and in some ways crueler kind. He let it be known through his regional manager that anyone in Larkspur Hollow who assisted the widow Rourke in her foolish claim against the railroad might find their own freight rates rising, their own credit at the mercantile called into question by the bank Vane partly controlled. Several townsfolk who might otherwise have spoken up about their own long-forgotten founder's shares grew suddenly quiet. A crew of section hands arrived one morning with orders to clear the dead siding of abandoned equipment, and it was only Amos Ferris standing squarely in front of the freight car's door, along with 2 other old railroad men who remembered Whitfield fondly, that kept them from hauling it away before Eda had even woken. Vane's attorneys filed a motion with the Territorial Land Office disputing the legality of the auction sale itself, arguing the car had never properly been listed as company property to begin with, and so could not have been lawfully sold, a maneuver clearly intended to strip Eda of her claim before it could ever be heard. For a stretch of nearly 3 weeks, it seemed entirely possible that Cornelius Vane, with his money and his lawyers and his years of quiet influence, would simply outlast a widow with $9 and a strongbox. What followed was not violence, for Vane was too careful a man for that, but it was pressure of a slower and in some ways crueler kind. He let it be known through his regional manager that anyone in Larkspur Hollow who assisted the widow Rourke in her foolish claim against the railroad might find their own freight rates rising. Their own credit at the mercantile called into question by the bank Vane partly controlled. Several townsfolk who might otherwise have spoken up about their own long-forgotten founder's shares grew suddenly quiet. A crew of section hands arrived one morning with orders to clear the dead siding of abandoned equipment. And it was only Amos Ferris, standing squarely in front of the freight car's door, along with two other old railroad men who remembered Whitfield fondly, that kept them from hauling it away before Etta had even woken. Vane's attorneys filed a motion with the Territorial Land Office disputing the legality of the auction sale itself, arguing the car had never properly been listed as company property to begin with, and so could not have been lawfully sold. A maneuver clearly intended to strip Etta of her claim before it could ever be heard. For a stretch of nearly 3 weeks, it seemed entirely possible that Cornelius Vane, with his money and his lawyers and his years of quiet influence, would simply outlast a widow with $9 and a strongbox. But Etta had learned patience from a man who set stone and thoroughness from a woman who turned scraps into quilts, and she did not flinch. She rode 2 days by wagon to the territorial seat and secured, with the last of her savings and a promise of future payment, a young circuit lawyer named Rebecca Hale, one of the few women then admitted to practice before the territorial courts, who read the ledger and the codicil and the journal entries with growing and unconcealed excitement, declaring that whatever else might be said of the case, the documents were, on their face, exactly what they claimed to be, and that a hearing before the circuit judge, already scheduled to pass through Larkspur Hollow that autumn, was the surest way to settle the matter once and for all, in the open, where Vane's quiet pressure could not follow. The hearing was held in the schoolhouse, the only room in Larkspur Hollow large enough to hold the crowd that gathered, and it seemed as though half the town turned out, some out of curiosity, some out of old loyalty to Whitfield's memory, and a good many, Etta suspected, simply to see whether the woman they had laughed at over a $6 freight car might somehow, impossibly, turn out to be right. Rebecca Hale presented the ledger and the codicil, and Amos Ferris testified to Whitfield's hand and to the old, unspoken doubts about his disappearance, and then, in a turn that not even Etta had fully anticipated, Rebecca produced a set of company documents Vane's own attorneys had filed years earlier with the Territorial Recorder's Office, showing his signature on a series of share transfers, and set them beside a sample of Whitfield's actual handwriting from the recovered journal. The forgeries, once the two hands were laid side by side before the room, were not subtle. Whoever had signed away certain of the disputed founder's shares in Whitfield's name during the 2 years following his disappearance had done so in a hand that curved differently at the letter W, that dotted its I's in a manner Whitfield never once used across 9 years of surveys and correspondence. Vane's own attorney, to his credit, went pale reading it, and Vane himself, called finally to answer for the discrepancy, offered only a thin and unconvincing account of a company clerk's error that satisfied no one in that schoolhouse, least of all the circuit judge. The judge's ruling, delivered 3 days later after a review of every document Etta had brought before him, was thorough and unambiguous. The codicil was upheld as a valid testamentary instrument. The auction sale of the freight car was declared entirely lawful, rendering the land office's dispute moot. And the founder's certificate recorded within the ledger, representing a controlling interest in the Larkspur and Western Rail line, was declared to belong, by the plain terms of Jonas Whitfield's own hand, to Etta Rourke, the widow who had recovered and restored his car in good faith, without any knowledge of what it held. She did not celebrate as a woman suddenly wealthy might be expected to celebrate. She thought instead, sitting alone that evening on the steps of the very freight car that had made her, in the eyes of the territorial court, the majority owner of an entire rail line, of her mother's basket of scraps by the Ohio hearth, and of the particular, quiet satisfaction that came not from what a thing was worth to her alone, but from what it could be made to mean for everyone who touched it. In the weeks that followed, Etta used her new authority not to enrich herself, but to undo, piece by piece, the years of quiet harm Cornelius Vane had done to Larkspur Hollow in Whitfield's name. She ordered every deferred repair on the line's engines completed before another crew was allowed to run a full route. She restored fair freight rates for the farmers whose grain shipments had been quietly gouged for years. She rehired, at honest wages, the very section hands who had once been sent to tear her home apart. And she set aside a trust, funded from the line's own profits, for the families of every man who had died or been injured in accidents the company's neglect had caused, including, at last, a proper settlement for Daniel's own family. 13 years too late to save him, but not too late to matter. And she rebuilt, on the very ground where it had once stood, a new boarding house near the depot. This one held not on a company lease, but on land deeded outright in her own name. A small, plain, unmistakable correction of the wrong that had first set her adrift. Cornelius Vane did not stay in Larkspur Hollow to watch any of it happen. Faced with a territorial fraud inquiry his forged signatures had all but guaranteed, and stripped by the court's ruling of the controlling interest he had spent 9 years quietly assembling, he sold what remained of his personal shares at a steep loss and left the territory before the first snow, and the town, in time, spoke of him less and less, the way a wound speaks less and less once it has finally been allowed to close. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, exactly where it began, with a 44-year-old widow standing at the edge of a rail yard, holding $9.40, while a crowd of men laughed at the foolishness of a woman who would spend 6 of those dollars on a car that led nowhere. What none of them could see that afternoon, and what Etta herself could not have known, was that the very qualities that had made her an object of pity and amusement, her patience, her willingness to look closely at what everyone else had already dismissed, her refusal to believe that worth and appearance were always the same thing, were the precise qualities Jonas Whitfield had bet his entire fortune upon, years before she ever arrived in Larkspur Hollow at all. She did not win a freight car by luck, and she did not win the railroad by accident. She won them both because she had spent a lifetime learning to see value where other eyes had already stopped looking, and because, when a moment finally came to prove it, she chose, as her mother had always chosen over that basket of scraps by the hearth, to make something whole out of what had been left for ruin. Thank you for spending this evening with Etta Rourke, and with the quiet, forgotten car that changed the fortune of an entire town. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value does not always announce itself loudly, and that patience, more often than we think, is repaid in full. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real worth in something the world around you had already written off? Until next time, stay close.